Another question to ask is, how many volunteers are we trying to have? And this is one where, somebody may be listening and they've literally never even thought of this question. If you do that projection and you're like, hey, we're hoping for 400 people this Easter, we're hoping for 500 people, you're gonna need at least 20% of that in volunteers. The funny thing is, it kind of works both ways. It's not just you're gonna need that to pull it off. You're gonna need for those people to be engaged in their mind, their heart, their soul, so that you see a number like 500.
Right.
Because who do you think is inviting people and talking about that they love their church? It's people that are really engaged and involved. And, we talk about that a lot, how, this kind of engagement and serving, it actually drives attendance, even though it's kind of counterintuitive.
This is Breaking Barriers, where we help pastors and churches grow so that they can go.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Breaking Barriers podcast. I'm Pastor Bobby, and I'm here today with Pastor Andrew, and we had an idea for today's podcast. We recently we have a Breaking Barriers cohort, so, if you never listened to the podcast, we have a conference, and we have a Facebook group, and one of the things we do as a cohort is a small group of churches that we walk alongside for about a year, and we'll meet with them every 2, 3, 4 months, and it's no new knowledge. It's not stuff that we don't share on the podcast. We're just really helping them work out the principles and going way deeper on some of the stuff. And so, this last one we just got done doing, part of the cohort was, towards the end of the cohort, it's a 2-day thing. Towards the end of the cohort, they're kind of writing up their plans for Easter. So how many services, what's the plan to recruit volunteers? What's the plan to help kind of develop an inviter culture within the church, just all this stuff. And we kind of formatted it at the end as kind of a Shark Tank where, they present their plans and, everybody in the room kind of hears it out and asks questions and all that. And I really benefited from it, just listening to all the questions and listening to all the guys' plans. And so it got me thinking, now is the time to start asking some of these questions. I think Easter this year 2025, I think it's April 20th. So this is the time right now to begin to ask some of those questions, some of those larger questions to help us plan and create tactics for Easter. And so that's what we'll talk about today. We'll probably have some other podcasts in the future to talk other Easter stuff. So we'll jump into that. Pastor Andrew, I'll turn it over to you just a little bit. I mean, some churches, ironically, are not even thinking about Easter any differently, and they think of any other weekend, and we just don't think that's the wisest thing in terms of, some of these big days and what we believe around that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Easter, and Christmas, but then also the other big days that we've talked about here, I think, your back to school weekend in August, you're certainly, if you really crush a kids week, that kind of idea, if you're still looking at Vacation Bible School Church like we are, then, the week after that, like the Sunday that thing concludes, can be a huge weekend. And there's other ones, Mother's Day, for example. But for us, we just have a huge part of our philosophy is around big days. Rich Birch says it like this: churches don't grow in seasons, they grow on big days. And we have found that really to be true, that when you really push on these big days, you end up having a lot of people that come into your church. They may end up not sticking, or they may end up sticking 6 months or a year later, but a lot of times the first time they come is on one of these days where the culture is sort of set up to be more in tune with either the faith, or there's something of a newness and a settling, for example, that happens when like summer's over and people are ready to get back in the routine of church. And so there's just some cultural things that happen that make these days big. And they're really important if you are a church that wants to reach a lot of new people. I mean, one of the things that we teach at Breaking Barriers is a really good benchmark for your first-time guest attendance in a year. The amount of first-time guests that you should have in a year is just think about your normal, everyday, average weekend attendance. So not on Christmas, also not maybe on 4th of July, but just your normal attendance. Let's say it's normally 300 or something like that, okay? Well, 300 probably then is a pretty good benchmark of what you should be shooting for in terms of your first-time guest per year. But the way it works out, and this is why this stuff's so important, I think it's so important that we're talking about it even now, when you got months away from Easter, is because you don't take that number let's say it's 300 and divide it by 52 and just think that's what we're trying to do every week, because it doesn't work out like that.
Right.
You end up having 4, 5, 6, we usually think about it in seven big days that are going to sometimes be 4, 5x
Right.
what a normal weekend would be in terms of your first time guest. And if you miss those 4 or 5, times, it's like, man, you're just not going to be able to make them up. And so we want to really focus on, hey, let's try to crush these big days, put energy into them. The culture's already given us a swell, so let's turn it into a tsunami, and see, those first time guests come in on these days.
Yeah, a lot of it is, because some people could think, well, every Sunday is important, right? Every Sunday is the Lord's Day, church gathered. And it's like, yeah, that's true. Like, we totally affirm that theologically. But in terms of the swell of momentum that you're talking about, it's like, man, we are in the church game. That's what we're doing, like another business, if you're in the retail game, end of the year, before Christmas, it's like, no matter what you do, there's going to be momentum and things are going to swell around that time, whether you plan for it or not. So we are big advocates of like, okay, where are those places of momentum? Christmas, Easter, back to school, stuff in the summer. And why not kind of accept, man, this is going to be, especially for the church, we're talking about, the resurrection and life change. Man, this is going to be a huge opportunity for momentum. Now, let's add a little bit of extra wisdom and strategic planning around the momentum that's already going to happen. And then hopefully what we could do is we can create a more momentum and follow up with people better and just create an overall better experience for people. And so that's really what it's all about.
I mean, it's a philosophical discussion, though. I mean, me and you have no problem talking about it because we're just, we have no problem with pragmatism, but I do think there are people that they just have a hang up. This goes back to the entire Breaking Barriers idea, right? Is that if you feel icky about it, you're not going to be able to run as hard as you can after. You're not going to be able to do the things that you need to do to make things work. Mm-hmm. And that's just true. This is a great example of that, like if somebody way upstream they just have like a real problem with even what you just said. You're like, hey, look at business or look at wisdom in the world. And there's things that, a swelling is going to happen. Mm-hmm. So let's take advantage of it. That smacks of strategy and pragmatism. And of course we think that's doing all things to the glory of God. We're like, hey, God's given us a brain. He's given us strategy. Like,
right.
Man, let's go after it, So you got to settle way up high what might be some of the reasons why people don't want to get way ahead and create strategy around these things. We have no problem with that. I feel like a lot more churches would be freed up if they could get away from some of that thinking and just think like, hey man, how can we do really, really well? Like, what can we do to the glory of God, do it really well? And that's going to look like some of the things that we're going to talk about today, which is just getting ahead of things more, having some creativity about you.
Yeah.
And then just seeing what the Lord can do in terms of bringing in a lot of new people.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, all churches do pragmatic stuff, like for sure. Like there's no church that doesn't do pragmatic stuff. It's like, man, got a roof over your head, you're using air conditioning and all these different things. They just choose to draw lines in really weird places when it comes to being pragmatic, Like right. You and I were hanging out, I think it was last weekend, we were joking around all the snow we got here, Most churches are going to be like, yeah, got to think about like salt in the sidewalks, right. So people aren't falling over. We don't have people falling over walking
right.
into church, and no one sees that as anti-biblical. It's like, hey, it's pretty smart if your whole parking lot's covered with snow. Let's go get that thing cleared out.
Right.
Like the Bible don't say nothing about that. Yeah. And it's like you're not some huge pragmatist because you want to make it a good experience, and you don't got older people falling down on the sidewalks
right.
heading into church, but. For whatever reason, somebody won't draw a line there, but they'll draw a line somewhere else. Like, man, you don't need to plan strategically for Easter or whatever.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to understand. I don't know. It's hard to understand. But
so some of the first questions I think we need to start asking when it comes to planning for big days, but especially Easter. And this is not an exact science by any means, but we have to get really good at trying to project, trying to forecast, looking at what God has been doing over the previous season, look at what God's been doing over the last year. Mm-hmm. And what are we expecting, or what are we praying for? What are we hoping that Easter attendance is going to be? And typically that's kind of where we start. There's a lot of planning going on at once, but that's one of the big questions you want to ask, because that's going to make a big difference when it comes to trying to create a good experience for people that have never been to church or have not been to church for a really long time. You don't want them to come in and feel unwelcome or not have a seat. And it's just like the hospitable thing that the church should do, to be thinking about those people. And so, yeah, one of the things we want to do on the front end is start kind of, creating projections. I know a lot of what we will do in terms of projections would be, okay, let's look at last Easter. That's a real simple starting place. How did last Easter go? How many services did we have? What happened last Easter? So that's one. But then also, typically Easter is going to be in the third or fourth month of the year. How's our attendance in those first 3 or 4 months compared to that same period of time the previous year? So like 3 weeks before Easter, we are 10% more people than we were that same weekend the previous year. I think that's a pretty decent starting place to start just trying to project, how many people are going to come. And then also, we can't just assume. I mean, this is something we pray about and, try to stretch and not just like, man, really kind of go after it,
Yeah.
What are some other kind of, in terms of that before, because you use that as a starting place to then begin to get into this big discussion of how many services, when are the services?
Yeah, because I think a lot of people just say they kind of have an attitude of like, we're just going to kind of see what happens, and it'll be great.
Totally.
And it's I think for us that, that could come from a few different places. It could come from a philosophical framework like we've talked about. I think more times than that, it just comes from, man, I was never taught to try to forecast the future. And, Daniel Lapin, in his book, Thou Shalt Prosper, he talks about how good leaders, they can predict the future. And I mean, not literally, but what he's saying is what you're talking about is they are constantly trying to do what you're saying. They're trying to forecast. They're trying to build, plans and models that are not just out of thin air. And I think we try to do that, like we're going to try very hard to stretch ourselves in terms of goal setting, but it's going to be informed by what we see God doing. Like one thing that got into me really early on, I heard a guy say one time, God can do whatever he wants, but it's incumbent upon his children to kind of take note of what he is doing, right? Like to see, he can move in any way he wants to, but how is he moving? And, what we've seen is like, there are just kind of trends, man. There's trends nationwide. There's trends for churches that are kind of on brand with us, that are sort of like us. And so we can look at that stuff and we can say, well, man, we're typically growing at this clip. And, this is what happened last year. And this is how many seats we think we can open up. And you put all that in a blender. And you guys sometimes predict thousands of people within 100. Mm-hmm. You're just able to do it. And that, there's times we're way off on that stuff. And God's just going to do whatever he's going to do. But it seems like the way he works, there's some formula between how many services, how many seats you open up, what's your growth rate, stuff like that. And then you end up kind of seeing who's coming. If you neglect those things, to your point, you're just going to end up not being ready. Mm-hmm. And we determined a long time ago that we felt like that was unacceptable.
Right.
Like we just try to get in our mind, every one of us have somebody that we're praying for, a family member, a close friend that's not a believer, that you just want desperately for them to come. And we just try to say, okay, what if that person finally comes and they walk in and there's not a seat for them? And this happened to us the other day at our Christmas services, right? Like 4 basketball players from UNCG or from High Point University. We've been praying to have more athletes come from High Point. Man, they walk in 10 minutes late to the Christmas service and they get ushered into a second overflow room and they're sitting there looking at a little TV, and wasn't the experience we wanted for them, right? If you put yourself in that mode, then you say, well, I can't control it, but I'm going to do everything I can do to try to be ready. Mm-hmm. And that absolutely, the top of that funnel starts with, how many people do you think are going to come?
Right. Yeah. And it's funny because I think going back to that, like breaking barriers, like just philosophy, the way that we think about this stuff, some people I think could be real cynical around trying to project Easter numbers, or like, man, that's real prideful, or that's real businesslike, or whatever, And I think our perspective is like, man, we're just not smart enough to just like pull a rabbit out of a hat and just guess. Like we kind of try to approach the numbers from a place of like humility, like, man, there's so much going on in the church. God has blessed us with so many people, and to be able to actually like try to track and count it, like kind of shows like humility, and we're going to use this stuff to help us to make better decisions. But it's just funny, like what, like kind of whatever philosophy you have on that stuff's going to determine, we're never going to count, numbers for Easter, or like, no, we're going to prepare the jars and try to create a really good experience for people. So after we begin to, and you want to do this probably 2, 3, 4 months before Easter, okay, we're praying for 10% increase this Easter, or 20%. I mean, those guys in that room, I think they were probably everywhere from like 10%. One guy was like 50% increase on Easter compared to the previous Easter. Most churches, in terms of just increase, they're going to have a, hopefully a doubling or a tripling at Easter in our kind of context. What do we start thinking about in terms of services? Because I know it felt like that when we got into that discussion around services and service times, there was some stuff that was drawn out that I feel like was kind of helpful for everybody. Because one assumption is like, all right, Pastor Andrew, we're expecting double the people to come this Easter. We're just going to double our services. There you go. End of story. Super simple.
Yeah.
But it's not always that simple.
Well, it's not always that simple. But that's a good place to start. I mean, if you're doing less than that, I'd say you're probably going to miss it. But
some people don't create any new services for Easter.
Yeah. I mean, the comment, so we got five churches in the cohort, which are just awesome, thriving, all between 500 and 1,000 in attendance. I mean, they're really great. And they're trying to think as well as they can about this stuff. And I think all of them made the same mistake of not having as many services as they needed. I think literally by the fourth guy where they're like, all right, add more services, But it's because they had all sort of done the thing that we've all done, which is they're trying to reverse engineer and they just leave some data points out. They just aren't thinking about it right. So, they kind of reverse engineer by saying how many seats are in our auditorium, okay? How many services do we need to put that many people in those seats? And what they leave out is all service times are not, I wish they were, but they're not created equal. Right. So if you got an auditorium that can seat 500 and you say, well, we could put 400 in there, that's probably going to work for 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock on Easter morning, but that don't work on Friday night and Saturday night and Sunday night of Easter. You can't assume you're going to pack, the place out. I mean, normally what Randy says is, and I think this is probably right. I mean, normally on really off-time services, you can get about half of what you can get in a normal service on a Sunday morning. Now, if you do a really good job with the vision and stuff, and you have another service time like we do Thursdays that is very entrenched in your culture, I think some of that you can pack that one out. But just like a slap brand new, we never do a Friday night or Saturday service, which none of us do, very few of us do. Then if you're just adding that new service time, the thought of it just kind of going gangbusters and maxing all the way out probably is not going to happen. And so it's not as simple as just take your attendance, divide it by whatever services you need. You're going to have to take your attendance, divide it by the services you need, with mixing in the math of what does 50% capacity look like on non-normal service times.
Yeah. So if I were doing the math, you would say, okay, how many seats do we have in our auditorium? Let's just say there's 200 seats in the auditorium. And then you say, okay, how many people do we think are going to be at Easter? How many adults, like in the auditorium do we think are going to be here? And then from there, say, okay, we need 800 seats across Easter. I'd probably, when doing the math, if you have two kind of prime time Sunday morning services, I would assume, man, those are going to be 90 to 100% full on a day like Easter. I mean, it's just going to, no matter what you do, those are just going to be completely packed. And then you would say, okay, we still need, 300 seats if we're going to fit all these people. And you would then start adding services. But to those services, it's, if you have 300 seats total, you're going to say, man, we're going to be able to fit, 150 to 180 in here in terms of that, off time, 50 to 60%. That's where it gets a little tricky, and that's where you really have to use some wisdom and try to figure out, because it's, the assumption sometimes I think would be like, okay, for Easter we're going to add services, and yeah, we'll just get people to go to those other services, And to me it would be like, we've all been to a Chick-fil-A when it's crazy around lunch and it's super packed, It would be like Chick-fil-A saying, well, we know the lunch hour is packed, so we're just going to add like a 3 p.m. lunch hour too,
Right.
And people will come to that. It's like, no, they're not.
Right.
Like, man, if you're going to get them to come to a 3 p.m. lunch hour, like, you're going to have to do some work.
Yeah.
And, that was a big part of the discussion. Like,
right.
Man, people don't just, everybody is kind of naturally, I don't want to say selfish, but just like, man, Easter with my family, 11 a.m. Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Wear our best, take some pictures, go to lunch afterwards.
Right.
That's just the natural framework people are thinking. And so if you're like, hey guys, it's going to be helpful, man, if you go to this Thursday night service or whatever, that's not going to cut it. Like you're going to need more leadership than that.
Yeah. I mean, you got to sell the vision that where you sit is part of the mission. And that doesn't happen the week before Easter. That happens 6 weeks before Easter, as you're talking about it every single week. It happens through email campaign. It happens through making sure a couple times the pastor stands up and tells a story about somebody who came on Easter and thank God there was a seat for them because somebody else had decided to come to an off service time. One of the things I shared in our cohort I think was really good is, I mean, some of the things that I've seen that have helped move people the most is when you have people walk in 2 weeks before Easter and there's a seat, there's a sign on their seat that says reserved. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you kind of realize like, oh my gosh, every seat in here is reserved. And then when you flip the thing over, it says reserved for, and then it's a story of somebody who, came and there was a seat for them. And, but the point is, it's to your point, it's not like you can say, it'd be like, just to follow your analogy, it'd be like Chick-fil-A saying like, hey man, the chicken is better at 3:00.
Right. It's
just way better. It's perfect between the lunch hour and dinner hour. And it's not, and that's what churches do, right? We're like, hey man, it's so cool to go to church on Saturday night. And I've tried to sell that too. And it's like, no, it really is just straight up, man. You might as well go for what the actual heart of it is. The heart of it is,
we need,
yes. Hey, you moving is teaching your kids not to be such a consumer. We sending people all over the world to plant churches in India. You can't move and sit on Thursday night for the sake of your neighbor. That I think is a better approach to help people actually catch the vision of like moving. Because you can do these off service times, but if you don't, like one of the churches said, well, we've done Saturday stuff before, but it just didn't really work. And it was like, I think they were having the realization too, that stuff don't work unless you work it. Mm-hmm. Having that service don't matter unless you work the thing, mm-hmm. Get people to move.
Yeah. And in some ways, at least the way that I think about it is because we've had this happen to us before where we could have prepared better, but we didn't. Even if you do all the different services and you do a really good job of casting the vision and all that, you're still going to have those services Sunday morning or whatever. You still may need a plan B in the moment for those services so that you're not literally turning people away, because we have been in the scenario before where, I mean, you're not literally telling them to turn around and go back to your car, but it's basically like, there's no more seats. We don't have another place for you to go and listen to this. And so I understand churches are space strapped and we are too, and we have different campuses and stuff, but it's a worthwhile thought process. Hey, like, man, God shows up in a crazy way and all these new people show up more than you expect, which very likely could happen. Is there any sort of, give them a gift card and ask them to come to another service or
we've done that.
Something to just, it's kind of like, man, break the glass if this happens, right. Sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've had some of this even in the last couple months, I think, where some of them weren't even expecting it. I mean, we've had that even post-Christmas where...
Yeah, multiple overflow venues are filling up and you say overflow venue, it's just literally sitting people in the office.
With a TV.
Right. I mean, that's all it is, man, so not great, but yeah, having some kind of plan.
Yeah.
Stuff. And I would say, the last thing I would say about that, Bob, you would see this as being true. I mean, I feel like it is just kind of universally true that like more services means more people.
Yeah.
You're going to end up with just more. I think people are. I think guys are scareder of the dead service because of you had too many than they are excited about the fact that you're going to end up with a higher bottom line number. And that feels backwards to me. Although I have felt that tension before. You're trying to play a game, right? You're like, well, why don't we have 10 services? And it's like, well, we only need 4. Well, maybe do 5. Maybe you don't have to do 10. Maybe don't do 4. But I think we would be of the opinion that you don't want to you don't want to pull back. You want to be like maybe over the line of what you needed a little bit. Because you're going to that more capacity is going to end up being more people.
Yeah. So, 3-4 months out, you're asking the question of attendance. You're asking the question of how many services. I think a couple other questions that you need to ask. And this is not even getting into the service planning or anything, because that's a whole nother discussion, right? Around, what you're going to preach on. Yeah. We're going to do baptisms, the worship. We're going to tell salvation stories. All this other stuff. We're just talking about very, very pre-planning so that you're kind of prepared, so that you're kind of enough services, you've set yourself up for success. Another question to ask is, how many volunteers are we trying to have? And this is one where, somebody may be listening and they've literally never even thought of this question, but we try to really challenge people with this. If you do that projection and you're like, hey, we're hoping for 400 people this Easter, we're hoping for 500 people, you're gonna need at least 20% of that in volunteers. And the funny thing is, it kind of works both ways. It's not just you're gonna need that to pull it off, but you're gonna need for those people to be engaged in their mind, their heart, their soul, so that you see a number like 500.
Right.
Because who do you think is inviting people and talking about that they love their church? It's people that are really engaged and involved. And, we talk about that a lot, how, this kind of engagement and serving, it actually drives attendance, even though it's kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah. I think that sometimes, people might be wondering this too. Sometimes the question is just, how do I get my church to grow? And, there's a spiritual side to that, man. God, we can't make it grow. Like, right. God makes it grow, But in terms of preparing the jars for what he's going to do, I think the number one thing is increase your volunteerism, right? That feels we have found that to really be true of like, hey, when you are prepared, it feels like God brings you about what you're prepared for. And, I think guys might say, hey, we want to have 20% growth next year, but they're not thinking about growing their volunteer base by 20%. They're thinking about it like, hey, once people start coming, we can try to filter them into serving. And we try to think about the exact opposite. Like, whatever we think we want to see in the future, we think the preparation for that now is going to be our faith on display. God, we're prepared for what you're going to do at Easter. And the way we're showing that we're prepared for that is by having these right volunteer numbers. And 20%'s about it. If you can hit, you want to hit 20%. I was talking to a young guy in Florida a couple weeks ago, and it was just great, man, talking to him. And it was like, hey, we're running 150. We want to run 200. I was like, well, how many volunteers do you have? And it was just about like dead on numbers. I don't know what it was. It was 40 or something like that. It's like, well, that's probably about 20. It's like, okay, well, you need to shoulder tap another 20 people, to serve, because if you're gonna, if you're gonna get, or maybe it was 250 or something, but it was like whatever it was like, hey, you're gonna need to shoulder tap 20 people to get in, so that those serve numbers are preparing the way for your attendance numbers. And I could tell it was like, oh my gosh, I haven't thought about it like that, but these big days are a time not only for you to think about it that way, but for you to teach your church to think about it that way.
Yeah. So for us, a lot of times before we're giving people inviter cards or, doing whatever, ads on Facebook or whatever you may do from like a real kind of marketing or, even organic kind of grassroots thing, we're challenging people to serve, and we're challenging people to catch the vision and don't just come and attend, but actually really be a part of this. And when you do that, not only does it help for Easter, but I promise you it pays so many dividends after that, where you end up gaining this like multi-month momentum from people, because some people, you challenge them, they start serving on Easter, they have a good experience, they meet some other people, they actually get involved in the process. They get to see people get baptized. And so they're like, okay, I want to do this again. They dive more in, maybe they're not giving, maybe they're not in a group. And the whole thing just kind of facilitates them being more bought in, which is going to help way beyond Easter. So it's not just, man, what's the inviter campaign, but the starting place is like, man, what is the communication and vision campaign to speak to our people about, hey, if you're here and hearing this 6 weeks before Easter, you're kind of part of the home crowd. So let's try to get them involved.
And I think, man, we have to just go back to say that all hinges on us truly believing in our heart that our folks serving is good for them.
Yeah.
That it just ties their heart to the mission, that when they give their time and their talent away to something like a mission trip or something like serving on the weekend, or it ties their heart more to what God is wanting to do, not just through them, but in them. And, their heart is going to be where their treasure is. And so it's like, that's that they're diving in greater ways. We have to believe that about them, because, if we don't, we'll just turn into kind of a multi-level marketing slick salesman to try to get them to go do our thing. But if we really believe, like, no, them doing this is so good for them. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think about that for myself. Like with my kids, like my picture in my mind of my kids being older is, they're, maybe they're young, maybe they just got married, but it's like, dude, they're attending one and serving one, and they're really committed to the tithe. And I'm like, I want that for them. Mm-hmm. It's not, whatever church they're a part of, then maybe they need it, maybe they don't, but it's like, I want that for them. Mm-hmm. It's going to tie their heart to the mission so much.
Yeah. And the last thing that I would say, kind of question to ask, so we talked about like thinking about attendance, how many services, how many volunteers do you need? The last thing in terms of this particular discussion would be, how are we preparing the jars in terms of what type of inviter kind of campaign that we're engaging our church with in terms of them inviting their friends, And I say prepare the jars because this is all kind of prepare the jars, like, man, we're praying for this attendance. We're going to open up this many services. We're going to try to recruit this many volunteers. And then lastly, when we're thinking of like creating that inviter culture, because that's how any big day is going to work, that your people are excited. They're inviting their friends. They're inviting their coworkers. I feel like you've done a really good job with this of, sometimes it's just casting the vision of like, hey, our church, we may only need to order, 2,000 inviter cards, but instead we're going to order 10,000 inviter cards, because we're kind of trying to make a point of like what we're actually preparing for, and that way that we try to create that culture of, hey, Easter is not just about you and your personal faith, although it certainly is, right? You don't just come to give, you come to give and receive. Mm-hmm. So it's not just you come in to receive, but like, hey, you need to be thinking about inviting somebody. And so, I mean, this is not rocket science by any means, but we're just taking a 4 to 6 week period in front of Easter. Sometimes it's a sermon series. Sometimes it's one particular sermon on evangelism. Sometimes it's a really creative kind of inviter campaign with inviter cards. There's a million things that you could do, but it's just kind of like starting that discussion so that it's not, oh, wait a minute, Easter's 1 week out, hey, man, you may want to invite a friend next weekend because Easter's coming up. Right. So speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what I was saying earlier about what you believe about them. Like, at the highest level, are you trying to get a bunch of people to go do your thing because they're cogs in your little wheel, or do you honestly believe that you, the pastor, are giving them the opportunity to enter into the mission and feel the electricity of God working through their life and using, and moving them along. And if you're just trying to convince them to get out and beat the streets and invite people in because you want to have a huge Easter, you're just getting them to do your thing. I mean, you're an Amway. Right. You're an Amway salesman. It's like a multi-level marketing deal. That's what it is. I'm convincing them. They're convincing their friends. They're convincing their friends. If it's like, hey, that person is going to grow like crazy by stepping out of their comfort zone and, inviting their coworkers to come or putting a flyer up in their office or the 1,000 other things people can do, they're going to grow from that, and God's going to use it, and people might get saved. I mean, it's just, it turns into a whole different discussion. And so we try real hard to push big. I think of two things. Like, number one, Michael Fletcher says, hey, you're never going to out-invite me. So I think our leaders, just trying to be really on the front end of that and saying, man, we're going to do a good job with this stuff. And then, you're not going to out-invite me. And the second thing is, I'm going to try to give you opportunities to be missional in ways that are very simple and understanding that most people, them inviting somebody to come to church with them is a huge step for them. And so we're going to do all the stuff like you're probably going to talk about, just yard signs and million, inviter cards and shareables. And we're going to give them TOMs, we call it, tools, opportunities, and models. So this is a meaningless statement, okay? Hey guys, devise a strategy, invite your neighborhood to come to Easter. That means nothing to anybody.
Right.
You stand up and you say, hey guys, I heard a story about some friends in our church that are doing, for Christmas, they did an open house at their house, a little Christmas cookies and eggnog, just to drop by 2 hours just for their cul-de-sac. And everybody was excited about it. And that was their way of handing everybody an inviter, a goodie bag on the way out the door and say, hey, we'd love for you to come to Christmas. And that is a model. That's a TOMS. That's a tools, opportunities. That's a model. That's somebody can go, oh man, that's actually, I could do something like that. So we try to talk about those things. These are what we're doing. We'll try to get real serious on social media, posting different ideas people are having, and just help people get missional.
Yeah, man, that's great. Yeah, I want you guys to hear, this is really a starting point, I think, to begin to plan for Easter. Because, like, man, even when we were in that cohort, one of the guys kind of noted, which is true, like, hey, man, it's just also like complex, like, man, I'm trying to get people to volunteer, and I'm trying to communicate service times. I'm trying to get people to move to off-site service, and I'm trying to get, them to bring their friends. I'm trying to get some people to get baptized. And
right.
I'm like, yeah, it is, but what I said is like, hey, man, for you to do these big days right, like, man, this is just part of the gig. And the reality is, when you think about it, if we're going to be good people, pastors, engaging our culture, a lot of times around these same holidays, right, the rest of the world is trying to get their attention too.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about Christmas services. I mean, you got some of the biggest, organizations in the whole world that are creating their own strategies to try to gain people's attention around that season so that, whatever they're selling or doing. So it can be complex, but I think it's important that
that's why you don't start 2 weeks before.
Exactly. Yeah. And, I think when you have this very broad plan, I do think it enables you to communicate it in a way that's a little bit more simple for your people, because it can feel like, man, I don't even know what you're asking me to do exactly. Mm-hmm. And it's like the further out you start, the more crystallized the vision is, the better it's going to kind of get down, staff, volunteers, pastors. And I think when you're doing this successfully, what it should feel like is, hey, we are all one big team that are working towards this mission around this big day. It's not the pastors getting, the church to do their thing or whatever, like you're saying. Like, at the end of the day, it should feel like, hey, man, we have prayed and fasted and prepared for this big day, and now we're all one big team, kind of heading in the same direction for God's mission. So hopefully this is a starting place. There's a lot more to say about preparing for Easter, but I think if you begin to start asking these questions, you're going to be way ahead.
Hey guys, jump in the Facebook group. We have one. It's on breakinggrowthbarriers.com, and that is the place to post your questions, man, ideas that you have. It's just constantly being updated with really good church growth and sending stuff. And so, man, make sure you check that out. Thanks.